taking control of the Temple Mount in June of '67. After that, things began to change in those heady days of Israeli sovereignty over the old city. Almost immediately, a campaign to make Israel illegitimate on many fronts was hatched by the Palestinians and their friends in both the East and the West. So boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS born in 2005. Last year, the Presbyterian Church USA voted narrowly to divest from Israeli companies, Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar. Okay, so if a bulldozer is used in the West Bank, then they feel that they did not morally want to be associated with that, and so they pulled those investments from their portfolio. It was really a big deal because the Presbyterian effort didn't start last year. It started several years ago, and the last couple of General Assemblies have been really contentious because of it. And there are some really good people within the Presbyterian movement that are opposing the BDS issue, but they did gain this victory last year. Now comes word, I actually read it this morning, that the United Church of Christ at their assembly at the end of this month is going to consider divestment. I will tell you this, in a moment I'm going to tell you why BDS is a real problem, where the real problem lies. But as an actual tactic that can really hurt Israel economically, it's not going to. But BDS is becoming popular among mainline churches. It's not gained traction with the evangelical churches so much. Other things involved in undermining Israel are gaining traction in evangelical circles, not BDS. One of the things I like to do when I research the proponents of the Palestinian narrative is to dig into their background a bit, look at their social media, who are they interacting with, who are they networking with. Anna Baltzer, that I mentioned in the previous session, Anna Baltzer is one of the drivers of this engine. And yet on her Twitter feed she has, I think, 7,000 followers. But the needle hasn't moved on those numbers much. And so what that tells me is that while she is personally passionate about that issue, I don't know that BDS is really a passionate issue for a lot of people. And here's why. Most thinking people understand the contributions that Israel makes globally. Okay? If you are able to call your daughter one evening when she's late coming home from being out with friends, you call on a cell phone whose technology was developed by the Israelis. Myriad ways that Israelis have contributed to society for the betterment. And so BDS doesn't ring true with your average person, in the pew, secular person, what have you. I mean, most people kind of get that. You want to boycott Israel for what? For contributing life-saving medical technology? What BDS has done is it appeals to a lot of well-meaning people, again, confined mostly to the mainline churches. The mainline churches are hemorrhaging members and have been for many years. And so, again, I'm not certain what their ultimate strategy is in terms of influencing people in the church. I just don't know that it's going to happen. And again, I want to be fair. Not all people who are proponents of BDS are left-wing radicals who really want to hurt someone. They just think that they are somehow contributing to justice for the Palestinians. But here's the problem. Whenever someone talks about boycotting Jewish business, I get nervous, and I'm not even Jewish. Remember our history. You know what happened when the Germans began boycotts of Jewish businesses in the 1930s? You certainly do. You don't even need a history lesson. You don't even need a refresher course. They began to single out Jewish businesses in Europe and first encourage people and then demand that people not cater to those businesses. Now, that's the first way they began to marginalize Jews in their society. They put out economic boycotts against Jewish businesses, and from there it was a short leap to actually physically harming them, stealing their property. And the rest, as I say, is history. The Holocaust is the final result of boycott campaigns that started in Nazi Germany, predating the war. It's when nonviolence is violent. Proponents of BDS will tell you that they are simply trying to gain justice for the Palestinians because there's no other way to make their voice heard. And it's a nonviolent strategy in the tradition of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. It's not exactly true. Over time, when you erode the legitimacy of a people, when you make them other, as the Jews have been made over the centuries, you ultimately end up with violent acts committed against them. And so the claim to nonviolent protest through BDS rings hollow for me, certainly. This is, of course, Kristallnacht in Germany, 1938, the night of broken glass, where the end result of the boycotts and the othering of Jews resulted in widespread destruction and death. They burned synagogues, they killed Jews, and then the next step was wholesale slaughter in the camps. And so one might say, well, aren't you taking that to an extreme conclusion, that surely you don't think that today proponents of BDS actually advocate at some point killing Jews? What I know is that they aim to marginalize Jews. And again, that marginalization leads to very bad things. So BDS is illegitimate itself for several reasons. I mentioned this earlier. Here is one example of a mainstream evangelical on the right, Lynn Hybels, with a BDS anti-Semitic radical like Stephen Seitzer. The top leadership in this country is pretty careful to be seen with someone like this. They don't want to identify too closely with BDS because they do know that it's a losing proposition with most evangelicals. And yet, Mrs. Hybels felt comfortable enough to be seen smiling here with Seitzer. Lynn Hybels, as co-founder of the Willow Creek Association, it's an association of about 9,000 churches globally. Huge, hugely influential from its base in Chicago. And what it does is it affords her the luxury to find causes to advocate for, and one of them is to advocate for the Palestinians. And so, not that they would pay attention to me, but a word of caution for those leaders that want to align themselves with somebody who pushes BDS. It's a losing proposition. And I think that you'll be not happy in the end that you were associating with such people. The whole BDS protest is so self-defeating. As I mentioned earlier, Israel is known for a lot of things, as all countries are. A lot good, some not good. But what is good is really good. And the Israelis are perhaps the most innovative people on the face of the earth, given the fact that they occupy a tiny sliver of land in their own state. They turned it from a moonscape into, a garden. And through their own hard work and innovation have created a lot of benefits for the rest of us. I was struck by this a while back driving down to the Dead Sea, and it is a moonscape in a lot of ways. It's a very barren land, although, has its own beauty. But tooling down the highway, and all of a sudden I come upon these palm groves everywhere. I mean, it's astonishing. This stark desert landscape, and then you see acres and acres of fully mature, gorgeous, green palm trees. That's Israeli agricultural innovation, drip irrigation, and the things that they've developed that are then passed on to other countries so that they can be self-sustaining. But they are truly bringing the land back from a bleak several centuries of inactivity. And so it just doesn't jive it just doesn't make sense to boycott a country with these kinds of capabilities for good. Okay, the Israelis have a great capacity for good. As I mentioned earlier, natural disasters are the first ones on the scene. And so again, they share technology like this with the rest of us, and so it in a certain sense makes the BDS campaign just silly. Another example of Israeli innovation, drip irrigation, which has been exported to other countries, including this one, for a country, and sadly your state is interested, I think, in conserving water. The Israelis don't have a lot of natural water sources, and so what they do have, they make the most of, and they've developed a drip irrigation system that continually feeds their crops right in the middle of a region that is just surrounded by sand. There's a group called Untold News that publishes stories like this, but just one other example of what Israeli ingenuity does. One Israeli researcher has developed a fabric to use in hospital gowns and other clothing. It's antibacterial, that saves lives. Okay? Does it make sense to boycott people like this? I don't think it does. What a boycott is really about is a political weapon to use against someone that you disagree with. But it's self-defeating at a certain point. You understand that? It's self-defeating. You're going to boycott Israel, but you're going to let other rogue nations get away with what they do? This is just kind of a funny image I saw the other day. A friend of mine who lives in Efrat, Israel, sent this. Here's a free Gaza shirt on the right. You know, I guess produced for Hamas or whatever. The kind of stuff that a BDS person would wear. And on the tag it says made in Israel. Oops. Again, highlighting the silliness of this campaign. And so while BDS has gained a lot of ink lately, I personally don't think it has a lot of legs. I think there are going to be other ways that people will oppose Israel, but just the silliness of the whole BDS campaign is there for everyone to see. This is Anna Baltzer that I was talking about earlier. One of the main drivers of the BDS effort, she's very active on Twitter and other social media, you know, very personable. If you wanted a face of the BDA campaign, that's probably the face that you would want. She's very, very passionate and driven. And what I noticed about some of her networks were very interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, mainstream evangelicals normally don't like to associate themselves with people this radical. And make no mistake, they're radical. A radical left-wing ideology. But if you look at the people on Twitter who do follow her, Shane Claiborne, Sammy Awad, and a company called Ethnographic Media, EGM Films. Now, the reason I mention that is because here is an introduction of mainstream, powerful evangelicals aligning themselves in some way, even in a small way, with someone as radical as Anna Baltzer. EGM Films produced the 2010 think 2010 film called Little Town of Bethlehem. Now, Little Town of Bethlehem is one of the worst anti-Israel propaganda pieces I've ever seen. But it was produced by EGM Films, which is owned and financed by Mark Green, founder of Mardel Christian Bookstores and an heir to the Hobby Lobby fortune. Now, I'm not telling you that Mark Green is a BDS radical, but I'm telling you that for them to be in any way associated with Anna Baltzer and the radical BDS campaign is not good. When you put all of these things together, when you put the pieces together and you look at the networks, you see that these people do share the same ideology in many ways. And what is that ideology in this point? It is to harm Israel in some way. The Little Town of Bethlehem film featured a Christian, a Muslim, and an Israeli. And it was touted as presenting balance. 3 different perspectives. No, it was one perspective. It was left-wing. They were all left-wing. So I'm just making the point that in these circles, this mindset, this whole worldview extends to other things. And so if you follow the networks, as David Horowitz at the Freedom Center says, you'll find interesting things. So, oops. Well, I've come to the end. That concludes our seminar today, the Why Israel seminar. I do want to take a moment for questions if anybody has a question, and then we'll wrap up. So the question is, what do people have to gain by being pro-Palestinian? It's a very good question. I think there are several answers. One is ingratiating themselves with people who could at some point cause them harm. You know, in other words, I'll throw the Israelis under the bus, I'll throw the Jews under the bus, but you know, they won't come for me, which historically always fails. That's one thing. The other thing is they do share the ideology. They do share the worldview. And I will tell you that after a long time of being involved in this kind of research, too many times when I come upon a Christian leader or lay person who really doesn't like Israel, what is back of it is a dislike of Jews. Okay? They don't like Jews. And so it's not hard for them to align themselves with a radical, because they themselves are radical. Anyone else? Yep.
Jim, why don't you, if you could, address, going along with that question, the obvious spiritual dynamic, the stuff that you don't see behind the scenes, the unnatural hatred that's not just current, but centuries, millennia in its making. Who are the people behind that, or better yet, spiritually, what's behind that?
Yeah, the question is, what is behind this kind of hatred? I mean, it's irrational. As a Christian, I will give you my view, give you my opinion. I believe it goes back to Genesis when we read about the fall, and you see there that God sets up, in essence, He establishes a state of war between good and evil, and what comes from good at some point is our own faith, the Messiah, the Bible, and those kind of things. And so evil is going to oppose that. And where do those things come from? With the Jewish people. And so I personally believe that Jew hatred at its root is a spiritual sickness. Because you can't explain it fully in the usual ways. Nothing fully makes sense. And you're very correct about the irrationality that kind of hatred. I've been at conferences where some of the people that I've spoken about have spoken, and interacting with them afterwards is a little disconcerting, because if you don't play along with their view of Israel and the Jewish people, then they sort of come unglued. One guy in particular I thought was going to get physical with me at one point because I simply mentioned that Arab rejectionism of Israel is a reality. And, you know, he kind of leaned in and raised his voice and was very upset. Yes, so speaking as myself, for myself, I would tell you that I think that's where the root of it is, which of course makes it very difficult to overcome. Education can do some good, and other things can help, but until a person's heart changes, there's not much hope that anything else will change. And what we have in our culture today, I believe, is an ideological divide. You have ideologues on either side, and then the great mass in the middle that really don't know, you know, they don't pay much attention to what's going on. For those who are passionately anti-Israel, I don't know what the solution is for them short of a spiritual change. And as I've said, I've seen it time and time again, and it's not pretty. It also explains why, as I've continually said today, that you can confront some people with the truth and they don't want to see it. You know, that term willfully ignorant, it's a good term. People don't want to admit it because they don't like it. And so again, back of a lot of the anti-Israel stuff is just simple Jew hatred, age-old Jew hatred. You know, the thing now is to say, well, you know what, I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Jew, and I'm not anti-Israel. Well, look, come on. It's all the same thing, and you know it. You know it is. They're trying to dodge the issue. But extreme anti-Zionists, they've got a problem that's pretty deep, and you know, where that ends up with them, I can't say. But in any way, to answer your question, yes, I think it's a spiritual root. Any other questions? Yes.
There's talk of a two-state solution, so there'd be a Palestinian state. Where would that be?
The question is, when talking about the two-state solution, where would a Palestinian state be? Officially, it would be in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, I don't have the map up, but when we were looking earlier, you see that Gaza is some distance from, but there would be a little bit of a land swap to make some type of highway or land bridge between Gaza and the West Bank. For the Palestinians, they have continuous territory. So, those two areas are officially what is supposed to comprise a two-state solution. The real problem is that the Palestinians, at least at the leadership level, have never really meant that. They do mean it when they say everything from the river to the sea. So in their minds, any state of Palestine, and again, I don't think they have any interest in nation building. I mean, that's boring. You know, let's be a revolutionary. That's a little more, you know, exciting. If in their heart of hearts, that Palestinian state would replace Israel completely. But the Oslo Accords were the framework for the two-state solution, officially. Yes?
I was curious if you've seen the difference between Gaza when it was given to the Palestinians today, the massive deforestation, essentially, the way they've allowed it to return to fallow soil.
Yeah. The question is about basically the plunder of Gaza after the Israelis pulled out in 2005. Yes, that is the case. Literally, as soon as the Israelis pulled out, the Palestinians went in, and all of the agricultural infrastructure, for example, that the Israelis left, the Palestinians began pulling down. They purposely destroyed it. Now, why would they do that? Because they're filled with hatred. They are not going to abide anything left to them that might be good because a Jew built it. Now, let me say this. I don't mean to demonize the Palestinian people. Their problem is their leadership. that is corrupt. The Palestinian people, and as a matter of fact, as Christians ourselves, we have a duty to pray for the Palestinian people. I very much want to see them unburdened from the heel of their own occupier, the true occupier, which is the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. If those people were left to their own devices, you know, they're talented. They could build a country that could flourish. But when you see that kind of irrationality, that kind of hatred, it comes from somewhere, and it goes back, I think, to that spiritual sickness. That kind of hatred isn't explained away very easily. And so that example that you cited, the destruction of Gaza infrastructure, has been repeated in other places. I mean, when they took control of Shechem, they took hammers and pickaxes to Joseph's tomb, just in a frenzy of hatred. That kind of thing is repeated wherever they are ceded land by the Israelis. Anybody else? Yes?
Would you like to get either one of those photos that I showed you upstairs that you might want to comment on? Are you interested in that?
Probably not. I think I'll just wrap, but thank you. We'll do that in the next one. Okay, the video will run now. Okay, what I'm going to do is we're going to play this video, which is terrific, by the way. But before I do that, I want to thank you again and the viewing audience online on behalf of the America-Israel Friendship League. We thank you very much for your kind attention, and be well.
University's School of International Affairs, I took many courses on the question of the Middle East conflict. Semester after semester, we studied the Middle East conflict as if it was the most complex conflict in the world, when in fact, it is probably the easiest conflict in the world to explain. It may be the hardest to solve, but it is the easiest to explain. In a nutshell, it's this: one side wants the other side dead. Israel wants to exist as a Jewish state and to live in peace. Israel also recognizes the right of Palestinians to have their own state and to live in peace. The problem, however, is that most Palestinians and many other Muslims and Arabs do not recognize the right of the Jewish state of Israel to exist. This has been true since 1947, when the United Nations voted to divide the land called Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews accepted the United Nations partition, but no Arab or any other Muslim country accepted it. When British rule ended on May 15, 1948, the armies of all the neighboring Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt, attacked the one-day-old state of Israel in order to destroy it. But to the world's surprise, the little Jewish state survived. Then it happened again. In 1967, the dictator of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced his plan, in his words, to destroy Israel. He placed Egyptian troops on Israel's border, and armies of surrounding Arab countries were also mobilized to attack. However, Israel preemptively attacked Egypt and Syria. Israel did not attack Jordan and begged Jordan's king not to join the war. But he did. And only because of that did Israel take control of Jordanian land, specifically the West Bank of the Jordan River. Shortly after the war, the Arab states went to Khartoum, Sudan, and announced their famous 3 no's: no recognition, no peace, and no negotiations. What was Israel supposed to do? Well, one thing Israel did a little more than a decade later, in 1978, was to give the entire Sinai Peninsula an area of land bigger than Israel itself and with oil, back to Egypt because Egypt, under new leadership, signed a peace agreement with Israel. So Israel gave land for the promise of peace with Egypt, and it has always been willing to do the same thing with the Palestinians. All the Palestinians have ever had to do is recognize Israel as a Jewish state and promise to live in peace with it. But when Israel has proposed trading land for peace, as it did in 2000, when it agreed to give the Palestinians a sovereign state in more than 95% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, the Palestinian leadership rejected the offer and instead responded by sending waves of suicide terrorists into Israel. Meanwhile, Palestinian radio, television, and school curricula remain filled with glorification of terrorists, demonization of Jews, and the daily repeated message that Israel should cease to exist. So it's not hard to explain the Middle East dispute. One side wants the other dead. The motto of Hamas, the Palestinian rulers of Gaza, is, "We love death as much as the Jews love life." There are 22 Arab states in the world, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. There is one Jewish state in the world, and it is about the size of New Jersey. In fact, tiny El Salvador is larger than Israel. Finally, think about these two questions. If tomorrow Israel laid down its arms and announced, "We will fight no more," what would happen? And if the Arab countries around Israel laid down their arms and announced, "We will fight no more," what would happen? In the first case, there would be an immediate destruction of the state of Israel and mass murder of its Jewish population. In the second case, there would be peace the next day. As I said at the outset, it is a simple problem to describe. One side wants the other dead. And if it didn't, there would be peace. Please remember this. There has never been a state in the geographic area known as Palestine that was not Jewish. Israel is the third Jewish state to exist in that area. There was never an Arab state, never a Palestinian state, never a Muslim or any other state. That's the issue. Why can't the one Jewish state the size of El Salvador be allowed to exist? That is the Middle East problem. I'm Dennis Prager.